Welcome to TMS WEB Core Hands-On. My name is Holger Flick, and if you have questions after watching this video, feel free to email me at holger@flicksengineering.com or contact TMS support. Today is all about a practical example using TMS WEB Core to build a contact form. But before you make a decision if you're going to watch this video, please look at the different areas that are being covered in this example. You might find some useful tidbits in there. The end result will be a contact page that you can integrate in your existing content management solution. Furthermore, these are the different steps that I'm going to take explaining the example. I'll start by introducing the web design. The web design will be created using Bootstrap 5. I'm well aware of the fact that Bootstrap 5 is not fully released yet, but why would I give you an example with Bootstrap 4, which is going to be replaced in a couple of weeks? So this video has more use for you in the future. Furthermore, we'll tie that design to existing TMS WEB Core controls, so you can provide implementation linked to the design. This is something a lot of people still struggle with, so I thought I'll give an extensive example for it with a practical use case. Regular expressions have also been added to the feature set of TMS WEB Core in one of its recent versions, so validating your form using regular expressions comes naturally. Furthermore, we'll send an email with the form information, so no backend with a database will be used. All application information will be client-side, you will not need a backend, and even sending the email will be done using a JavaScript library. And finally, and this is truly optional, I'll show you how you can integrate the application into a content management system. In this case, I'll use my personal web page, which is written in WordPress. Delphi is an awesome programming language, but it's not the best tool for web design, plain and simple. So either use some of the professional web design tools that are out there, or a very cheap solution, it's free, is Visual Studio Code, which comes with excellent HTML support. And as I've already explained in one of my previous basic videos how to build a web design using Bootstrap hands-on, just as a quick reminder, if you go to the plugins, there is the Live Server plugin. And that gives you the ability to start a live server based on an HTML file. So if you are in an HTML file, as I'm here right now, it's an empty template. I just changed the title of the HTML page to Contact Us. And then I can click right here on Go Live, which will open a web browser. And the web browser will point to the file that you're designing in the editor right now. So I'll do this side by side like this. And you can also determine the browser that is going to be started, but by default, of course, as Visual Studio Code is from Microsoft, it'll be the Edge browser, but it's fine because Bootstrap literally looks the same on each browser, so you have no downside using Edge to design the layout for your page. In order to get started, you need to integrate Bootstrap into your HTML design, and if you go to getbootstrap.com into the documentation, there's several approaches to integrate CSS into your page. Let me just give you a short hint what I started doing. On GitHub, you not only have the chance to upload your source code. If you go to your profile, there's also something called gists. And gists are excellent for tiny little code snippets that you use over and over again. You'll be amazed what kind of gists are out there from other developers. So for example, here I have my personal gist to integrate Bootstrap 5 with Bootstrap icons. So I simply go to this gist right here, go to the raw view, and I copy paste. Of course, I would also be able to integrate this as a link into my HTML design. Of course, you don't want to be dependent on gist, or especially my gist, so simply copy paste, go back to Visual Studio Code and insert it. As said, this is not necessary, but you can build your own gists also with Delphi source code, Delphi snippets. I also have seen gists for tiny little data sets that you use over and over again. For example, there's gist with the states of the United States, there's gist with the countries of this world. So reoccurring things that are not like big, huge databases, stuff you need over and over again. Back in the day when text processing applications started, we called them text blocks. So now that this is included, I should already see a difference in my layout or not. Not really anything happened. I just include these files. These are also the so-called CDN references, meaning if you are in the United States, you get Bootstrap from a different server than when you are, for example, in Australia. It's optimized so you retrieve your style sheet from a server that's optimal to you. So this kind of approach makes your web pages load in a very optimized way as well. So going from here, our page needs some sort of title, but remember we're building this as a plugin into an existing page. So the only thing we need is a container that we encapsulate our page in. And that's exactly what we call it in Bootstrap, a container. So we can say div, or let's use the emits. We say div.container, which makes the editor converted to div class equals container, like this. Press tab, and there you go. So all of our page will be included in the container, which is, if you look in the Bootstrap documentation, the thing to you start with a container. And the next thing you're supposed to do is either use text or start building a grid. I found out that there is this wonderful class called lead, which allows you to write text that is a little bit more emphasized than standard text as a lead-in to something. This is the perfect style if you want to have a lead-in for something like a form or something. So I use this with the paragraph tag and insert the text. For example, contacting us is easy. Just fill out the form below and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. So that's what we're going to use. And now as I save this using Control S, you see that our page already is there and it is responsive. So let's keep it like this on the low resolution. This really gives us the view in for different devices. For example, this would be the iPhone most likely, and if we keep going bigger, this is most likely something, this is the iPad, and this is almost desktop size. Let's look at the finished example. So the first name, last name, build a row. So we have 2 columns, and on the next row, again, we have 2 columns with email and subject. And then finally, we have the message supposed to be sent in a big text area spanning all columns. And then on the left, a button to clear all information in the form, and on the right, the actual button that will send the information or create the email that is being sent. Because we do not send anything anywhere, there is no backend involved. Bootstrap 5 has a great new style style class for the form attribute, and this is exactly what we're going to use. The form tag has a class which is called row, and this is exactly what we're going to use. So the form class, we don't need an action, we just need a class, and the class is called row. This means you define a form, and the form is specified by its rows, and each row in Bootstrap has 12 columns. That's fixed. No matter which device you're on, each row in Bootstrap has 12 columns. So what this does is you specify only columns inside of the form tag, and as soon as 12 columns are reached, the next row is being used automatically by the style. And that makes it really, really easy to build a form. In our case, as we want the first name and last name in one row, that means each of those is exactly 6 columns, because 6 plus 6 equals 12, right? What we do is we simply start by defining the first name, so div. Everything is divs in Bootstrap, and the class that we're going to use is call for column, and MD6 tab. So what are we doing here? We're saying, okay, we want to start with a column. The column uses 6 of the 12 available spaces, so to speak. And MD means as long as our screen is bigger than MD, then we will use 6 columns. As soon as it's smaller, meaning like an iPhone, for example, these rows will be stacked and no longer shown next to each other. I'll show you with a demo on the right away, then you'll get it right away. So let's say, what do we need? We need a label, and we also need an input. And I'm going to copy paste that from the existing example. So here you see we have a label for what is the label? For the common text element that I'll define next. And the class you have to use is form label. Then between the label tags, you specify the actual caption, which is first name. And then we start specifying the input element of type text. There's plenty of other types, password, email, and so on. Class is form control. ID is text first, TXT first. This is exactly what links the label to the input element. And this ID will also be used to link this input, which is nothing else but an edit control in the browser. We'll link it later on to our TMS WEB Core control so we can access it. So later on, if we will access the control which is tied to the element TXT first, we actually affect this HTML element in our layout. And a placeholder gives you the chance to define a text that is shown when no data is entered. So let's save this. And on the right, we see immediately the result. Only half of the screen is used because 6 is half of 12. And this means here we can easily add the last name. You can also see that first name is nicely separated from its edit text. Right now you see John, and as soon as we type something, the text, the placeholder disappears and is replaced by the actual input from the user. So this is all pretty straightforward. You copy or you create the next block with your next element, which is yet again 6 elements. So again, call -md-6. And then instead of tying the label to TXT first, we tie it to TXT last. Completely same definition. You can literally copy paste text again and text last, placeholder John Doe for John Doe. And if we save this now, we have first name, last name, and exactly the look that we want. Just as a general note, this is not formatted properly and it makes it hard to see, so you can right click and use format document, or you can use Shift-Alt-F, whatever you prefer, and everything is formatted nicely. As explained before, we do not need to specify the rows manually because we now have reached the sum of 12. 6 plus 6 is 12. So the next column we define will end up here. Use the next column, paste it here, and again, 6. This time it's going to be the email, and the input type is not text, it's email. That indicates to the browser that you want to enter an email. We're not going to make use of the browser features here. We are going to validate the email address using TMS WEB Core. So this is purely academical. It won't have any effect on the form whatsoever. And the placeholder is just a sample email address. When you save, you see that everything bounces down into the next row. We do not have any distance between the rows. You can fix that easily by adding a gap to the row. G stands for gap. Dash indicates you want to specify a value between 1 and 5, 5 being the highest gap. Let's save this here. See, big gap. If you do 1, small gap. So I usually do G3, which gives me a nice comfortable distance between the different form elements. You might also notice the tiny little symbol here. I also explained that in a different video, how to add icons to your Bootstrap layouts. Go to that video for a detailed explanation. Just be aware here, I use this BI envelope, which is the icon for a tiny little envelope, which I added in front of the actual caption of the label. In order for this to work, I used my gist, as explained in the beginning. This is the line that adds the Bootstrap icons to your style sheet. So far we've only defined the first column. The second column is going to be the subject. So I'll insert that. Same approach as before. Subject, txt subject. The label refers to the input control. The input control is of type text again. And instead of giving an example value, I give instructions as the placeholder. I save first name, last name, email, subject. And now the final part, spreading 12 columns, because we want it to be spreading the whole screen, is going to be a text area. And again, copy, paste it here. And as we have 12 columns, it's going to be the full width on any size, so we do not need to specify MD or anything. Col 12, it's the label for the message. I once again add a tiny little icon, and instead of input I use text area. I specify the minimum number of rows I would like the design to contain, which is 5, and that's it. The message truly spreads the whole screen, meaning 12 columns, and which is twice the size as the 6 columns. Responsiveness works perfectly, which you can see right now. So here, everything is in 2 columns, and I drag it over, and as soon as we hit the media breakpoint MD, meaning we go smaller than that, the form changes its appearance, and everything becomes aligned underneath each other. Underneath each other is, of course, something that I call it, the official term is stacked. All the form elements become stacked. As soon as you go bigger, they become aligned in the layout that you specified here. I used MD. Of course, if you want this still to be 2 rows, you can simply do SM, for example. That would make the breakpoint even smaller, meaning like you have to make it smaller for it to become stacked, like so. Before that, the first name and last name are still next to each other, but as soon as you become even smaller, they become stacked too. So that gives you the ability to even have different media breakpoints for different elements in your form. The final part of the form are the 2 buttons, one to reset the form information and the other one is to send or create the email. Everything is done using TMS WEB Core and nothing is done in JavaScript, which is included in this HTML layout. So just insert the HTML to create the buttons. For that I use a div of the full length of the form from here to here, and in order to use justify content between, which aligns everything to the left, the right, the middle, maxing out the distances between the different elements, you have to switch to the flex mode. And inside of this container I specify 2 buttons, and the buttons are, I can do that slowly, very big. So as it's designed also for phones, you could make them bigger, but if you take away the button LG, I'll do that for the first button, it is being resized differently. You have to do it for both buttons actually, because you use flex mode. So this means both buttons are not as tall and the font also got a little bit smaller. Design options are plenty with Bootstrap. Just be certain that if you specify button, then specify button LG. It does not suffice to just specify button LG. You have to do button first, then button LG, and then you can also change the color of the button using button danger or button success. Danger is red and success is green. Nothing more to it. Just make sure that you assign an ID from the reset and the set button as well. And with that, our design is ready. We can start by creating a new TMS WEB Core application. This is what you'll see if you create a new TMS WEB Core application in Delphi Sydney. The main project HTML, I renamed it to index.html, and the main form, I named the unit uForm main. I will also now name the form to form main. That's it. And the application is there. If you run this, you will end up with an empty web application as expected. Nothing is on the form. And the first step, what we'll do is we open up the tree in the project manager and double click on View Form Main. And the HTML right now is pretty basic and will lead to nothing more but this being used, and then the Delphi form designer takes over, meaning everything you define here in the form and drop on it would replace the design, the non-existent design, I have to say, of the HTML file. So we replace all this with the design from our HTML file. Paste, save, and if I run the TMS WEB Core application now, the design is almost there. So you can see that the fonts aren't right, but at least it looks like a Bootstrap application. The next step to do is to import the controls automatically. You can use Control Sync, or alternatively, you can drop all the controls that you want to use on the form and then bind them using control binding. And if even that is too much of IDE support to you, you can manually set the element IDs. The fastest and most efficient solution is Control Sync. That's it, 6 controls added. What I always do is I replace the text of all the edit controls with empty strings, like so, enter. And the most important thing, however, is that you go to the element font property of your form and advise the form to use the setting for the font from the style sheet and not from the designer, from the properties specified in the object inspector. That is of utmost importance. And what makes it so important is that the controls that are being created right now using Control Sync have the parent font property set to true. So they use the same setting. If you run the application now, you already have the design that you desire at this stage. All the fonts are correct, and the behavior from the HTML, of course, works. With all the placeholders, everything is in place. Missing, of course, is any interaction. Nothing happens if you click the buttons or if you enter any of the data. Next, set CSS library to Bootstrap. This will take care of the fact if you have a message dialog, a show message, that these elements of the application will make use of Bootstrap 2. That is very important, because otherwise your show message looks very, very old-fashioned. Let me show that real quick. You go to button send, and let's say show message, or let's even do a message dialog. Message dialog, just press button, my keyboard. Okay, empty information, for example. And we have an OK and a cancel button. And that's it. We don't need to specify the 0 that we're used to from the VCL. And at this point, CSS library isn't set to anything. So we click the button, and the button is already tied to the control inside of the designer. And that is the power of TMS WEB Core, that it is that easy to tie a template to controls. I really don't know how TMS could make this any easier. And you see that this dialog now clearly is not in accordance with the look and feel of the application. So click cancel, close this, and simply switch the form CSS library to CSS Bootstrap, save, run again. And if we click send now, it's nicely styled using Bootstrap. I'll remove the example implementation that doesn't make any sense. And we'll focus now on the real implementation to create an email based on the things that are inside of the form. But before we do that, we actually have to validate the content that's inside of the form. And for this validation, I'll use 2 methods. The first one is to check if the input is valid. This function will check all the values, meaning first name, last name, they are required, so they can't stay empty. And then the email address. And in addition to that, I'll need one additional function, which uses regular expressions to test if the email is valid. I'll pass a potential email address, and it'll return a Boolean value telling me if that email is valid. For the reset button, I also need a method which clears all the information. So I call it func or procedure. Doesn't need to be clear fields. And the final procedure we need is the procedure that actually sends the email. With form methods added to the form class, the whole functionality of this application can be implemented. Control-Shift-C, clear fields is pretty easy to implement. I don't think anybody will struggle with that. All the controls, which are named, by the way, as you named the IDs, for example, txt last, txt subject, txt email, txt first, exactly named. The controls are named precisely as their element ID, which you can see here in the HTML. And another interesting fact about all this is that it also automatically picks the control. So these are all web edits because it's one line. But of course, the text area has to be a memo control. And we realize there is no memo control and the memo doesn't exist. So we go back to the main form and see how that can be. So going back, text area, class, form rows, no ID. So if there is no ID, TMS WEB Core won't sync it and add it into your form designer. So ID equals txt body is what I usually use for things like that. Txt body, close it, go back into the designer, and we can't click Control Sync again. It won't overwrite anything that has been created already. Control Sync, poof, added one control. And the nice thing is that now we have a TWEB memo because it's text area. It's not an input control, it's a text area, which is multiple lines, and in Delphi, that's a memo control. Again, I also remove all existing text, which we don't find here as a text property. But of course, we know it's the lines property. Remove the text. Okay, save. And now you see text body lines.clear can be used to clear the fields, and setting all the text properties of all the different form fields to an empty string yields the result that we desire to remove all values. Of course, the final step is we have to double click on button reset to implement the reset click event and call clear fields from there. And at this stage, let's see, I type some data in here and I click clear, and all the values have been removed as expected. Validating email addresses with regular expressions is easy, especially if you have Google available. You simply Google for a pattern that can be used to identify email addresses. I am very well aware of the fact that there's like way more sophisticated strings out there to match these things. This is just one of them, and it yields pretty good results that suffice for this example. The class TREGEX has to be added to your users clause. I use an IDE expert from Stefan Glinke. It is the users clause tool he offers. You can simply press the hotkey and it immediately suggests the unit that you can use in order to use a certain class. In this case, WebLib regular expressions. I can say I can add it to the interface, or the implementation interface is fine. I just press enter and the users clause has been updated. Great tool from Stefan Glinke. Google it. It is free. So that is all we need to do to validate an email address. We call TREGEX with the method isMatch, and then we pass the email address, pass in a parameter here, and the pattern. And this method returns true if the string in an email matches the pattern, and the pattern is of course chosen that only email addresses match it. So is input valid, that matches all the input of the whole form, simply becomes L email valid is a Boolean value, is email valid, and we pass the text that has been entered into the edit field with the email address, and then we also create a second Boolean variable, lcomplete, which simply compares the text properties to an empty string. And if all of them are not empty, lcomplete is also true. So the whole form is true if lcomplete and email valid are both true. That's it. So sending an email should really only happen if the input is valid, right? And that's exactly how we design it. We say in our onClick event of the button send, double click, implement it. We say if input or is input valid, then begin send email. And otherwise, we're going to show a simple error message that all fields are required or something like that. I copy paste. Okay, so that's it. Let's run this. We click send, insufficient data, a should not be good because that is not a valid email. See, insufficient data, at insufficient data, at me.com. Poof, no error message. That will work. Also, remember, this is all responsive. We can make it smaller, and this works. TMS WEB Core uses the HTML web design that we defined in our Bootstrap template, so nothing changes that. The workload you have to do in order to get this functionality is zero. It is all contained in the HTML and in the CSS. You can completely focus on implementing the application behavior. And that is the #1 strong point of TMS WEB Core if you have a web designer or if you want to outsource web design. Because let me tell you one thing, I can do a simple form, but I would never assume I'd be able to do professional web design because web designers have a decent education when it comes to color calibration, to forms that we as developers simply do not have. So in a nutshell, if you want to build a professional user interface and would rather have a web designer build it instead of a developer, TMS WEB Core makes it really easy to incorporate web design into your applications. The key functionality of the form is to send an email, and I wrote a class, the SMTJS wrapper. And what is that? Sounds fancy. Well, it is. There is a library out there, smtpjs.com, gets you to it. It's a library that you can use to send email from JavaScript. You include it using CDN with including a script tag to this simple page. So how did I do it? Well, I updated the index.html of the application, or I have to because I haven't done it yet. And this is something that drives me crazy in Delphi right now. It always goes into this code view, which I don't need, into this design view. I want to go to the code view. And what we have to do is, into the index.html, we move the Bootstrap references and also the library that we need to send the emails. Why do I move it into the index.html? Simple. So if we ever were to update the Bootstrap version, I just have to change a single file and net all the different forms that we created. So go in here, underneath the script, I insert the Bootstrap information that we added to the main form, Bootstrap 5. Go here, remove it, save, go to the index.html, paste. So now our Bootstrap will be used for all the forms that TMS WEB Core will use. That's #1. And then we need to use the SMTP.js. And for that, we include a script to the source given inside of the help text that I just showed you. What you also have to do in order to use this great library is you have to create the credentials for your SMTP server. Those are not passed with username and password because obviously the JavaScript source code of your application is being transferred to the browser. So it would be a huge security leak, including the username, password, and server name and all that in your source code. So what you do is you create a token, which you create from this web page. The web page encodes your SMTP server information into a secure token, which you can then use to send email. And this is literally all you need to do in JavaScript. That's the key point. In JavaScript, this is the code you need to call in order to send an email. So how do we do that in TMS WEB Core? Obviously, the optimal solution is to have a wrapper class that we just call with the information, and we don't have any JavaScript. That is the optimal solution, and that's why I'm going to show it to you. Let's add a new unit to the project. Add new unit. And let's save it as SMTJS wrapper. Save. And as a class, we define the class SMTPJS wrapper. And we define a class procedure send with a recipient, name, sender, subject, and body. That's all we're going to need. We implement it using Control-Shift-C. And the implementation is now given precisely, the implementation is now exactly as given on the web page, because TMS WEB Core allows us to integrate JavaScript into our application using the ASM keyword. Kind of like, think of it, if you do create a VCL application, ASM, assembler, is machine code. The machine code of the web is JavaScript. So TMS WEB Core gives you the ability, using the ASM keyword, to dive into the machine code of the web, which is JavaScript. I'll paste my code and explain it in detail. First of all, the secure token, of course, I removed that because you have to create your own token with your own SMTP server information from your server. But everything else, if you look at it, is precisely copy-pasted from the documentation from the web page. See it right here. So I simply copy-paste it, and I replaced it with parameters that I handed to the procedure. A recipient is right here. Remember not to use the string identifier these or these in JavaScript, because then JavaScript is going to use a recipient as a string and not insert the variable. So even the variables and parameters can be used in the ASM code as if they were JavaScript variables. That makes TMS WEB Core so darn powerful. I also define a variable lBody in TMS WEB Core, and I add the name that I pass to this procedure and then the body, because I don't have any means to specify the name inside of the email because I'm getting an email, and then the body of the email is going to be, hey, this user emailed you that text, instead of just having a body that was in the message field from the form with the sender email. So I also have the name in addition to that. Another interesting thing that was added rather recently to TMS WEB Core is the pass2JS compiler flag, because if I remove these, Delphi tries to interpret the assembler code given here, which is not a good thing to do. So with the compiler directives, Delphi doesn't see this. Only the pass2JS compiler sees this code. So this makes it perfect for JavaScript code that you don't want error inside to trip with. And that's literally it. That's all you need to do. Of course, the email.js reference inside of the style sheet is important, because otherwise this call email.send is not going anywhere, because this call is being defined inside of the style sheet. With this class being in place, go back to the main form, and then SMTJS wrapper is in the unit uses SMTPJS wrapper. And with that, compile, and compiles. And that's it. So with this wrapper, emails are being sent to this email address with this additional information, which is taken from the form. The form is being validated, and that is exactly the functionality we wanted. Done. In order to deploy this application to a web server, we switch the build configuration to release. We compile again and switch to the release folder or have a look at the release folder. You can go there very quickly, right-clicking the project, show in Explorer, and then we can go to the TMS web directory release, and there's our files. Everything is nicely bundled up in one file with the JavaScript and 2 files for the web design. Now these 2 files can be deployed to a web server and your application can be accessed using the index link. So I did this with my web server on Flix Engineering, so I can go to https web core flixengineering.com/contact/index.html. And there we go. This is the working application deployed on a web server with HTTPS, no less. You might also notice I didn't have to do anything in order to support HTTPS. That is something the server does, the web server, so my application doesn't change at all. Everything is encrypted at this stage. Even that is handled right now. The final step is that I didn't just want this form to be loosely coupled via a link in my content management system. So looking at my blog right here, the plugin that I use is called iframe, advanced iframe, and that allows me to specify the URL, a width, a height, and additional tags if I wanted to include content from a different URL in my page. So here's the contact page embedded in my WordPress architecture, so to speak. And inside of that, I have this block with my application. And that's it. That's really it. There's nothing more you need to do. You just specify the URL and the page becomes part of your web page. If we go to visit page or visit site, contact, here's the headline that you just saw in the editor. And here is the running application completely included into the template. It even works with the navigation bar and everything. And of course, the functionality, you type something that doesn't make sense, send, is exactly the application that we've implemented in TMS WEB Core. You've just seen how easy TMS WEB Core makes web design with Bootstrap 5, building responsive user interfaces that could potentially be done by web designers working in cooperation with you, the application developer, so you can focus on application design using controls provided by TMS WEB Core, making use of regular expressions, something that is very complicated to do in JavaScript, and send email to an email address using JavaScript, which is embedded in your TMS web source code taken from the JavaScript documentation from the provider. All of this doesn't need any backend, it's all client-side, and we've even shown that within a couple of minutes you can easily integrate it into an existing content management solution using HTTPS encrypted transfer. For more exciting news about TMS WEB Core or other examples, other tutorials, go to web.tmssoftware.com.